Welcome, friends, to another in our series of episodes talking about Old Testament lives, characters, and they are characters, heroes with feet of clay. Today we're going to talk about Joshua. Like George Washington for the United States, first in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen, Joshua, in many ways, is the George Washington of the nation, the formed nation of Israel. Moses brought them through the Red Sea and the wilderness, of course, but it's Joshua who's led to then bring them into that land, establish them in that land, this man or administrator of peace, first in peace. But he's also first in war because there were people in that land who didn't want to give it up easily, so he was a mighty warrior as well. We're going to spend a couple episodes talking about this first in peace and then first in war, this mighty man of God, Joshua. So Joshua, what do we know about this man? Surely one of the great heroes in Israelite history, in Old Testament history, but unlike almost every other character that's within this series, we actually know very little about the biographical background and history and family of Joshua. We know that he's the son of Nun. And that's about all we know. We know he's from the tribe of Ephraim, one of the 12 tribes. Joseph, that patriarch, had his two sons, Manasseh, Ephraim, made up the 12 because Levi, that one didn't get a piece of the promised land. So anyway, he's from the tribe of Ephraim. That's about all we know. If he was married, we don't know it. If he had children, we don't know it. We know he lived quite a long time. He died at 110 years old, full of strength and vibrancy, the way it was described about Moses. But we know he was a great leader. And initially, he pops on the scene in the book of Exodus as the lieutenant, the kind of primary leader, even general, under Moses. Moses, the clear leader, of course, in Israel during that time of the wilderness wandering. But Joshua became early on one of his most trusted lieutenants and key figures for sure. So Joshua, whose actual name at first was Hoshea, and it says that Moses renamed him Joshua, but didn't rename him much because in the Hebrew, Joshua or Hosea or even the word Jesus are all pretty much the same word. It'd be like us saying Tom and Tommy and Thomas. They're all pretty similar, and all of them mean in the Hebrew, the Lord saves. So Joshua, someone that clearly is someone for whom the Lord was going to save his people, is a man who is a man of great wisdom and great strength. But Joshua is the one that Moses could depend on to carry out his orders. For instance, you might remember back when they were going to send that original set of 12 spies under Moses, when they finally got to the edge of the promised land and they sent the spies in to see if it really was as good as the brochure said. Was it a land full of milk and honey? And Joshua and another man named Caleb were among those 12 spies who just investigated the land and found out it was even better than the prophecies had described. But you might remember that the vote came back 10-2. 10 of the spies said, yeah, it's a great land, but the giants are tall and we feel like grasshoppers. And they said there's no way. They've somehow forgotten the God that got them through the Red Sea. So Joshua and Caleb were the lone minority report on that committee saying we can go and we can go now, but they got outvoted. And for 40 years then, the children of Israel spun their wheels in the wilderness until the entire generation, faithless as they were, died out, with the two exceptions of Joshua and Caleb. They were the only two of those original ones who came through the Red Sea whom God allowed to also cross into the promised land. So Joshua is this man, but of all the people, he's the one that God ordains to be the follower, the successor to Moses. Now, can you imagine what it would be like to follow Moses? I mean, Moses, it says, was in fact, when he dies, it says there never had been and never would be again another leader, another prophet like Moses, someone to whom God spoke face to face, someone in whom the mighty works of God would happen. We've talked about Moses already in this series. Hope you'll go back and look at that again. But so how do you follow Moses? It's so difficult to follow a great figure. I mean, imagine following George Washington as president. Poor John Adams, stuck between George Washington and Thomas Jefferson. He's almost like an interlude, right? A palate refresher. It's hard to follow a great leader. I'm from Alabama. Some of you know. What's it like to follow Bear Bryant? Well, poor Ray Perkins found out and had 3 losing seasons. It's so hard to follow a great leader. How do you follow Moses? But God had tapped Joshua on the shoulder. And so even during Moses' lifetime, he enjoyed the blessing, the anointing, not only from God, but from Moses himself. He was the one, younger though he would be, he was the one who would lead them into this promised land that now after 40 years they found themselves right on the edge. Joshua, son of Nun. So here's what we know about him. Like Moses, Joshua was also called a person who was a man after God's heart. He was called the servant of the Lord, which is actually a very high title. He's someone like Moses to whom God spoke face to face. He, like Moses, actually wrote down, in his case, he wrote it himself, he wrote or etched onto tablets reminders or repeats of the 10 Commandments that God had written himself and given to Moses. So he's a spiritual leader and as well as the administrative leader of the people of Israel. There has to be someone to follow even a great leader. Reinhold Niebuhr, the German theologian, once said that nothing of really great significance can happen unless it happens in more than one lifetime. You can't really accomplish something great in a single lifetime, and so we're saved by faith. Well, this is a great action of God, and it's for Joshua to pick up the mantle now, to pick up the baton and to run the next lap of the race that Moses began. It's onto Joshua, this young leader, who will follow Moses, and he follows him well. What he does, it shows that he's a spiritual leader of Moses' people, of Israel, is that like Moses, he calls them to remember the covenants of God. He calls them to be faithful. He reminds them of those teachings that God gave through Moses about obedience and how if they obey to the letter, God will bless them. If they don't, God will withhold the blessing. He reminds them of that. He leads them into covenant and spiritual renewals. He's more than just a warrior. We'll talk about Joshua the warrior in a moment, but he was more than just that. He was a spiritual leader as well. And maybe that shows up best by looking at the story about how he leads the children of Israel across the Jordan River. Now remember, because it's going to echo this, you remember God led them under Moses through the Red Sea as he leads them out of Egypt from the captivity, and he stops up all the waters and they go across on dry land, the waters come back together. You'd think they would have never forgotten that, but of course that generation, except for Joshua and Caleb, had all passed away. But now their children are on the border of the Jordan River, which is no Red Sea, but at this time of the year, March, April, most likely, at this time of the year, the Jordan River is at flood stage. What that means is upriver, the Jordan River comes from the Sea of Galilee, and the Sea of Galilee feeds in from there, the Jordan River, up to Mount Gerizim, the very highest mountain in all of Israel. The snow cap on top of Mount Gerizim would melt, of course, in the spring, and all of that would come all the way through. So this time of the year, the Jordan was at its highest stage. It would have looked like a mighty torrent. Some parts of the year was more like a trickle, but this was a mighty torrent. And yet at that very time, when it was the most difficult of all times to cross, God says to Joshua, okay, it's time to cross the river. And we may not realize how hard that is because we've got bridges and roads. Rivers are nothing to us. Rivers were a major obstacle in that day, especially at flood stage. And God says to Joshua, it's time to go. We're not going to wait for the flood stage to go. It's time to go. And here's the odd way he had him do it. And Joshua, give him credit, was obedient to God's command because it took faith from the beginning. He said, take the priests, put on their shoulders the very ark, the symbol, this representation of God being among his people, the Ark of the Covenant. Have the priests put that ark on their shoulders and let them go first. So they're the first ones to move out. And they take the very ark of God, the one thing you'd protect at all costs. They take the very ark of God first. It's not armies, it's not the Corps of Engineers, it's the ark. And it says they go up to the very river, and they could have prayed all day long and that river would have never stopped. But when the soles of the priest shoes hit the water, when they had to put their weight on their faith, then and only then, the water stopped. It was the Red Sea all over again. And don't you know those children of their parents who'd heard those stories as if it was fairy tale, like, oh my goodness. And they walked across, the ark staying with those priests in the middle of what was the Jordan, dry ground, and all the armies, actually, 40,000 of them, walked across, marching toward Jericho, which would be their first conquest. The priests stayed in the meantime right there. Joshua called for 12, a man out of each one of the tribes, and said, pick up a big stone out of the Jordan River as you're going across, bring it across to the other side, and they stacked up those stones, put them kind of in a circle. They call that place Gilgal. The name Gilgal literally means circle of stones. So they made this circular pile of stones with those 12 stones, one from each of the tribes. And Joshua said, from now on, when this river comes back together, which is what it would do when the ark came out and they were all across, From now on, come to these stones and let these stones remind you, like a memorial, like a monument, that God did a great thing right here. He also put a pile of stones in the middle of the Jordan that nobody could see when the Jordan River came back together. This is important because in the book of Joshua, stones are signs of memorial again and again and again for Joshua. So he builds this first stack of stones in Gilgal, their first entrance into the promised land on the heels of a miracle. And it shows again, of course, that the same God who was with Moses, even though we don't have Moses anymore, that same God is still with us. He's with us with Joshua. So Gilgal became an important place for them to come back to again and again, like Masada is today in Israel. They commissioned Israelite army officers on Masada, this hilltop where they held out valiantly against the Roman oppression in 70 AD. They remember this enormous, significant place even today in Israel. So that's what Gilgal was for them, was this like the Alamo is for Texans. It's this wonderful sacred spot. In that place, though, in Gilgal, Joshua also began to show them that you're the people of God here. So one of the first things they did is they celebrated the Passover. The first one was when they got out of Egypt, you remember? The Passover of the death angel. Now they celebrate Passover with celebration that God has brought them past over the wilderness too. God has brought them to this promised land. And there they celebrated the Passover. There they circumcised a whole nother generation, another physical sign that they're God's people. Because they wanted to do all of that to be God's people before they took up the armament to be God's army. Joshua never wanted them to forget who they were and who fought for them. So from that place in Gilgal, they would return again and again to remind them who they were. And Joshua did a covenant renewal ceremony right there. That would happen again. Later on, after it would be another significant battle, the city of Ai, when they defeated that battle, he also erected another stone altar, and they had another covenant renewal ceremony. This is in Joshua chapter 8, and he recited for them the entire story of God, going all the way back to Abraham, reminding them of God's enormous faithfulness all the way up to that victory that they just had. And he put a pile of stones again together for them to remind them, whenever you come here, let this be an altar of remembrance and gratitude, but also to give you hope and courage. Here's a phrase that comes up again and again to Joshua. Be strong and of good courage. Trust in God. God's faithful. Obey God. Obedience matters. And God will help you to be strong and of good courage. And that's what Joshua was. And because he was, other people around him were. But the book ends with Joshua doing it one more time. When finally the battles have ceased and all the dust has settled, Joshua's last act was to gather the people together, this time a little bit further north in the land of Israel, a place called Shechem. And once again, he gathers them together and he erects another stone again. And he says, here's the covenant. Before I die, he's 110 years old now, I'm going to now pass the baton to others, but the God who lives is still here. And for you and all the generations that follow, it's important that you pledge yourselves again to God. Don't forget, this wasn't your mighty work. It wasn't your valiant warrior-like abilities. It was God who fought your battles. If you ever forget that, you're on your way to losing. And so that's when Joshua says, I can tell you, whatever decision you make, but as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And the people said, we will too. And so one final time, 110-year-old Joshua picks up a stone. He said, he set it down right there beside the altar of God, and he said, then let this stone be a reminder to you of a covenant that we have all made to the God who sustains and gives us courage and great strength. And that's a story that I think for all of us. It may well be like Joshua, you may be serving in a time of peace, because Joshua also is the one who organized the land and distributed all the inheritance. He's the one who made this thing really work in the land of Israel. But whatever it is, whatever season of life that we serve the Lord, what's important to know is this: God can be trusted. God is faithful, and will be faithful if we'll let him fight our battles, let him be our courage and our strength. You and me, we too, can be great men and women of courage and of faithfulness. It's a great story. He was first a man of peace, and he was a man of God. And because of people like Joshua, the people of God thrived in that promised land.
Images for Heroes with Feet of Clay are provided by Kingstone Comics.
The best-selling book of all time. Now, the most complete graphic adaptation of all time. Action, adventure, romance, doctrine. history, the future. The Kingstone Bible. Own it today.
The Kingstone Bible and Kingstone Comics, available at the First Church Book Center or online at kingstone.co.